Hey there, interwebs, and welcome back to Who? Fascinating. Things tend to move around a lot wherever I live, but there are three statuettes which I like to keep on my desk. They are Athena, goddess of wisdom, Gumby, the literal embodiment of flexibility, and Diogenes of Sinope, also known as Diogenes the Cynic. Although the first two are fictional characters, the third one actually existed. He lived during the 5th and 4th centuries BC and is considered to be, as the latter epithet implies, the father of cynicism. Typically on this sub-series, we take C-list historical figures such as Walter Hunt and Gertrude of Nivelle, debunk the one thing that most people know about them, and focus on the fascinating truth instead. But that may prove more difficult today. Diogenes lived nearly 2,500 years ago, so assembling a truthful account of his life is a big ask. He's literally older than Jesus, and we all know how much that guy's biography got embellished over time. Despite Diogenes having reportedly authored more than 10 books, half a dozen tragedies, and a volume of correspondences, none of these writings are known to have survived to the present day, so the best we have to go on are second-hand accounts of his contemporaries and scanty archaeological evidence. That's why, although Diogenes is a man, a myth, and a legend, I'm going to focus more on the myths than the man today. Regular viewers of this channel should know that I like to make up words, such as magnafluent and pseudonymonic, and one of my favorite bespoke words is philosophial. The English word philosopher comes from the Greek word meaning lover of wisdom, and my word philosophile means a lover of philosophy. Just like how Shakespeare's Romeo was more in love with the concept of love than he was with Rosalind or Juliet, a philosophile is someone who is more in love with philosophy than actual wisdom. It's essentially anyone who is all theory and no application. That was most of those ancient Greek thinkers, especially Plato, and more on him in a moment, but definitely not Diogenes. Now, if you're like me, you think about philosophy an awful lot for someone who claims to detest the subject, and if that's the case, then Diogenes is the wise guy for you. I like to describe him as the philosopher who hated philosophy. But let's start at the beginning. According to the stories, Diogenes was advised by none other than the Oracle of Delphi herself to deface the currency. Conveniently, his father Hychesius was a banker, and Diogenes likely went into the family business too, although we don't know for certain. In truth, almost nothing is known about his early life, but the story tells us that he and his father were exiled from Sinope, losing their citizenship and all their worldly possessions after becoming embroiled in a scandal with the adulteration of the currency. Fortunately for historians, the archaeological evidence supports this story, as great numbers of deliberately defaced coins from the right place and time period have been found, along with contemporary coins bearing the name of Hychesius as the official who minted them. Following his expulsion from his hometown, Diogenes moved to Athens and decided to take the oracle's advice more figuratively. Ignoring the physical coinage this time, he began devaluing the political currency of social customs through what was essentially performance art to challenge established beliefs. In one of his most famous stunts, and the one which is recreated in the figurine on my desk, Diogenes walked through the city streets in broad daylight shining a lantern as he went. When curious onlookers quite predictably asked him what he was doing, he replied, "I am looking for a man." If you've heard this story before, it probably used the phrase, "an honest man," but according to the ancient sources, he was looking for any man. It was his view that the unreasoning behavior of those around him made them no better than mindless beasts. Think of it like the ancient Greek version of "wake up, sheeple," except the person shouting it was a homeless philosopher instead of a homeless conspiracy theorist. It seems that unthinking reliance on pre-existing beliefs was one of Diogenes' bugbears, and the difference between nature and nurture in the form of social custom was a common theme of classical Greek philosophy. And speaking of equating humans with animals, that brings us to the other most famous Diogenes story. Even a cursory Googling will inform you that Plato was Diogenes' arch-nemesis, so it should come as no surprise that when Plato started running his mouth, Diogenes was there with a vibe check in the form of a plucked chicken. You see, every good philosopher's name is associated with some pithy three-word phrase. René Descartes, cogito ergo sum. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, eat the rich. Socrates, this tastes weird. Diogenes' battle cry is, "Behold, a man!" accompanied by brandishing poultry. If you somehow aren't already familiar with this story, it goes as follows. Once upon a time, Plato was asked by one of his students at the academy to define a man. Because Castlevania wouldn't be created for another 2 millennia, a miserable pile of secrets wasn't a valid response, so he instead answered that man is a featherless biped. When word of this definition reached Diogenes, he brought a plucked chicken to Plato's next lecture and loudly announced, "Behold, I have brought you a man!" In response, Plato appended, "with broad flat nails," to his definition. Although it's tempting to describe him as the anti-Plato, Diogenes himself probably would have applied the title to his mentor, Antisthenes, who he considered to be the true disciple of Socrates and not this Plato pretender. If you believe the biographer Diogenes Laertius, no relation, Antisthenes ignored Diogenes' initial requests to mentor him. When Diogenes wouldn't give it a rest, he was eventually forced to beat the man back with his walking stick, but as he wound up for another swing, Diogenes essentially shouted out, "Strike as hard as you like, but there's no stick hard enough to drive me away so long as I think you know something worth learning." This must have endeared him to the man, because Diogenes became his pupil afterwards, at least according to the story. As evidence of how little we know of his real life, it's a mystery if the two men ever even met. Regardless of whether or not they did, Diogenes would go on to surpass his supposed mentor both in reputation and the practice of his beliefs. Antisthenes was an ascetic, meaning one who abstains from luxury, indulgence, or excess, and Diogenes took this to the extreme, residing in an overturned clay pot and living on handouts. According to one legend, upon seeing a young boy drinking from his cupped hands, Diogenes discarded his wooden bowl, deriding himself as a fool for having burdened himself with the unnecessary baggage for so long. Earlier in his life, he owned a slave named, I kid you not, Manes, but shortly after their mutual arrival in Athens, Manes ran away and escaped. In keeping with the character he would later become, Diogenes dismissed this misfortune, allegedly saying if Manes can live without Diogenes, why not Diogenes without Manes? Based on what we know of the man, he had nothing but disdain for masters who could do nothing without their slaves, considering them contemptibly helpless, and when given the chance to expound on people who care more about their possessions than themselves, he said that in a rich man's house there is nowhere to spit but his face. He would later find himself on the other side of the relationship after being kidnapped by pirates and sold into slavery. According to Menippus of Gadara, upon being asked his trade, Diogenes replied that he knew no skills apart from the governance of men, and advised that he be sold to a man who needed a master. His reply apparently amused and impressed his new owner Xeniades, who put him to work as a private tutor to his children. This all brings to mind a famous quote from a more recent philosopher: "The things you own end up owning you." In truth, Diogenes belonged both to no one and to the entire world. Perhaps as a result of losing his Sinopean citizenship, he would later declare himself to be a citizen of the world as a whole, inventing the word cosmopolitan in the process. Although the word has become rather trite these days, better associated with fruity cocktails and injuriously terrible sex tips, it was quite the radical way of thinking at the time. In ancient Greece, a person's identity was intimately, some might even say inseparably, tied to citizenship of a particular city-state or polis. Unfortunately, nationalism and its kissing cousin, toxic idiot patriotism, have not gone away in the intervening millennia, but I have seen many younger people who take a more globalist view, which I'm going to attribute to the increased connectivity facilitated by the internet. It's even given rise to the neologism netizen as a new kind of global citizenship. Getting back to Diogenes, we've established his legacy of conflating people with animals and vice versa, but turnabout's fair play. In many of the anecdotes which feature him, he is described as dog-like and or otherwise associated with dogs, and he's described in some accounts as Antisthenes' loyal hound, or dogging the man's footsteps. Although we don't know if this canine comparison was something he made up for himself, or originally an insult which he proudly appropriated, we do know that he praised the many admirable virtues of man's best friend. In addition to the obvious positive qualities like their loyalty and dogged determination, not sorry, he also believed dogs could inherently discern friend from foe, and that they lived in the moment without anxiety, and thus had no use for abstract philosophy. No wonder he's so popular with younger generations on the internet. We also love dogs and have no money. Also, can I just say that a philosopher saying we should aspire to be like dogs because they don't have philosophy is one hell of a flex. Because they're free of society's artificial inhibitions, dogs are shameless and will eat, sleep, crap, and even screw in public, and that last one is where we get the British term dogging. In fact, when accosted for public masturbation, he only lamented that his hunger could not be as easily sated by rubbing his belly. He also peed on a man who called him a dog and then asked why was he so surprised. Even the name of his philosophy, cynicism, literally means doggishness. That's why I find it especially ironic that these days the word cynical has taken on connotations of negativity and a dark view of humanity, which couldn't be further from a typical dog's mentality. The thing which feels much more appropriate is this dog philosopher's fondness for walkies. Before I can elaborate on Diogenes' solution, however, I suppose I should outline the problem for you. Once upon a time, there was a pre-Socratic philosopher called Zeno of Elea, and he became famous for his three paradoxes of motion: the arrow paradox, the dichotomy paradox, and the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Although the former and the latter are both fascinating in their own rights, the dichotomy paradox is the one which is relevant to today's story. The gist of it is that in order to move somewhere, I must first move halfway there, but before I can reach the halfway point, I must move halfway there, ad infinitum. Therefore, I can never get started, and thus logic seems to imply that motion is impossible. Although Zeno died roughly 20 years before Diogenes was even born, he was survived by his paradoxes, which made their way to the ear of the future cynic. When presented with this argument, Diogenes supposedly muttered solvitur ambulando, or rather its Greek equivalent, then got up and walked off. For those who don't speak Latin, solvitur ambulando translates to "it is solved by walking," and these days it refers to solving problems with practical experiments rather than relying on theory. It's also one of my personal Latin mottos, and to be honest, I could and probably should do an entire video on the subject of this simple two-word phrase, but that will have to be a video for another day. For the time being, I'll just leave some links to further reading in the description and keep focused on Diogenes. His short, simple reply was basically the ancient Greek version of a mic drop, and if you ask me, this is a perfect illustration of the old maxim, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they're not. All of this high-minded thought and rhetoric was smashed by one simple demonstration, and one which was done in the most incisive and irreverent way possible. Diogenes' casual disregard for authority wasn't limited to his colleagues and philosophical forerunners, either. It extended all the way up the social ladder to Alexander the Great himself. You see, ATG had personally been tutored by Aristotle, who was himself the pupil of Plato. Having likely heard stories of Diogenes from Aristotle, Alexander admired the man, because how could you not, and he decided to pay him a visit. After finding the famous philosopher hanging out in the town square, catching some rays, the great and powerful man asked Diogenes if there was anything he could do for him. Diogenes answered, "Yeah, step aside, you're blocking the sunlight." First point goes to Diogenes. Alexander, the brave general, was so impressed by this boldness that he remarked, if I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes. And Diogenes, without missing a beat, replied, and if I were not Diogenes, I too would wish to be Diogenes. In the words of New York's most cynical social theorist, Walter Kovacs, 2-0, your move. Another story says that Alexander found Diogenes looking at a bunch of bones, and when he asked him what he was doing, Diogenes answered, "I am looking for the remains of your father, but I cannot distinguish them from those of a slave." Regardless of which story you prefer, Socrates taught Plato, who taught Aristotle, who taught Alexander, and Diogenes schooled the whole lineage. I like how Plato is remembered for saying that we don't truly understand anything because all that we see is but shadows, and Diogenes is remembered for saying, "Step out of my damn light." Talk about wizard brain versus lizard brain. Now fast forward about 4 centuries. A crowd is getting ready to throw rocks at a promiscuous woman, but Jesus supposedly says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," although he may have just been claiming first dibs. For contrast, when a known prostitute's son was throwing rocks at a crowd, Diogenes told him, "Be careful you don't hit your father, boy." We can only hope this happened in winter, because he'd need some ice for that burn. Similarly, after watching an archer's shots land all over the place, Diogenes went and stood by the target, remarking that it seemed like the safest place to be. There's clearly no denying the fact that Diogenes spent his whole life trolling people, and that didn't stop at his death. We don't actually know for sure how he died, but according to some, his death was brought about by an infected dog bite, in a cruelly ironic twist of fate. Others say that in his willful stubbornness, he simply held his breath until he expired. Regardless of the actual cause, he supposedly requested that his corpse be casually discarded and tossed outside the city walls to rot. People asked him why he wasn't bothered by the thought of being eaten by buzzards and other wild animals, and he replied that he should be given a stick with which to fend them off. They then pointed out that he wouldn't realize the animals were eating him, on account of being dead, and he replied that if he couldn't tell, then why should he care? Basically, every popular story about Diogenes feels like it should end with that sunglasses meme. In fact, I believe this is why he's become so well received by more recent generations. Millennials and Zoomers make heavy use of internet memes, which are known for their style of anarchic humor, but also an irreverent playfulness, and there was probably no philosopher of antiquity more anarchic and irreverent than Diogenes. But that's just my opinion. If yours differs, feel free to let me know in the comments, because that's it for this week. I usually end my videos with some variation of the phrase, "have a nice day," but considering the subject of this one, I offer the facetiously cynical words of my friend when I said the same thing to her. Don't tell me what to do.